Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into the world of diplomacy, American diplomacy specifically.
Sounds exciting.
It is. And we've got an incredible guide for this journey,
Cool.
Stuart Eisen and his book, The Art of Diplomacy.
I've heard good things.
Yeah, really insightful stuff. And we're also drawing from his interview on the American History Hit podcast.
Oh, very cool.
So he really, he's been there, he's seen it all, from Nixon's trip to China all the way to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Wow, that's quite a span.
It is. But the big question is,
Yeah.
can those successes from the past, actually help us navigate the craziness of the world today?
Right. It's a different world now, that's for sure. And that's what I find so interesting about Eisen's perspective.
Yeah,
He doesn't sugarcoat things,
Yeah.
He acknowledges that things are really fraught right now.
totally. You see it every day in the headlines, right? The tension with China, Russia, the divisions, even within the West itself.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, for sure.
Yeah, constantly on edge.
But that's exactly why we need to understand how diplomacy has worked in the past.
Okay, so looking back for potential solutions.
Yeah, not saying history repeats itself exactly, but maybe there are some lessons we can learn from those who've dealt with similar challenges.
Makes sense.
And Eisen makes a really important point about the U.S. It's not the only superpower anymore.
Right.
The landscape has completely shifted, so our approach has to adapt too.
It's true. The world has changed a lot. So let's actually talk about diplomacy itself,
Oh.
okay? Because Eisen calls it an art,
Uh-huh.
which to me sounds way more interesting than, just boring boardrooms and paperwork. What does he actually mean by that, calling it an art?
Well, he's talking about the unique skills and qualities that are needed to actually manage those international disputes and interests, through negotiation.
Right.
But it's not just about the agreements themselves.
Okay.
It's also about understanding the human side of it all, the dynamics between people.
Interesting. So more than just being tough at the negotiating table then.
Right, exactly. It's deeper than that.
Right.
So what are some of these qualities? Well, Eisen starts with determination.
Okay, determination.
Successful diplomats have to have this unwavering commitment to finding the right moment for a deal,
Oh, I see.
even when everyone else thinks it's impossible. Think about Nixon going to China.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a move that most people thought was unthinkable at the time.
Absolutely. So maybe a bit of a gambler's instinct too, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's where courage comes in. Nixon going to China, Sadat visiting Jerusalem.
Bold moves.
Huge risks, potential backlash.
Yeah.
But those leaders knew that to achieve peace, sometimes you got to step outside your comfort zone.
So recognizing when the reward is worth the risk, basically.
Exactly. Now, Eisen also talks about intelligence, wisdom, and judgment. And he uses Kissinger as an example, with the whole opening to China. It wasn't just about showing up. It was about strategic thinking, anticipating problems, basically reshaping the global order.
So not just being smart, but having that big picture vision.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not all grand strategy either. It's also about meticulous preparation.
Preparation.
Yeah, Eisen tells this fascinating story about Jimmy Carter at Camp David.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
So Carter knew that Prime Minister Begin really adored his grandchildren.
Right.
And when the negotiations stalled, hit a wall,
Uh-huh.
Carter used this little personal detail to actually unlock a breakthrough.
Wait, really? How did knowing about Begin's grandchildren make a difference in the big picture?
Well, it's actually brilliant. At a super tense moment, Carter gave Begin these autographed photos of the three leaders,
Oh, wow.
but they were addressed to each of his grandchildren by name.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it really touched Begin. It created this opening for him to kind of soften his stance and agree to try again.
Wow, that's incredible. The power of a personal touch, even on a global scale.
It's true. And it leads right into the next quality Eisen talks about, listening.
Yeah, listening.
But he takes it a step further and calls it unsympathetic empathy.
Unsympathetic empathy? I don't think I've heard that before.
It's about really getting the other side's perspective, even if you don't agree with them or their actions.
That sounds really hard, especially with adversaries. How's it different from just plain empathy? And why is it so important in diplomacy?
Well, empathy is about understanding and sharing feelings.
Yeah.
But unsympathetic empathy means you acknowledge those feelings,
Okay.
but you don't have to endorse the actions behind them,
Interesting.
And in diplomacy, that's crucial, because you can engage with the other side's position without giving up your own.
Makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
But isn't there a risk of appearing weak if you seem too empathetic?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. You got to show willingness to understand without compromising your own principles.
So where's the line?
Well, Eisen gives a great example with James Baker, Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush.
Okay, tell me more.
Baker did something unusual. He invited the Soviet foreign minister to his ranch in Wyoming.
His ranch?
Yeah. It went beyond those formal meetings and helped forge a genuine connection.
Wow, so stepping outside the roles to build a real relationship.
Exactly. And it shows Eisen's point that diplomacy isn't just a cold, calculated game.
I like that.
It's about finding win-win solutions.
Yeah, building bridges instead of walls. And that human element really seems to be a thread throughout all of Eisen's experiences.
Definitely. And we haven't even touched on back channels or the role of military force.
Oh, right. I bet he's got some interesting thoughts on those, too.
Oh, absolutely. His
Yeah.
perspective is super relevant to everything that's going on in the world today.
Well, I'm definitely ready to keep going. Let's dive into those next. Back channels, huh? You mentioned them before, and I gotta say, it sounds kind of mysterious.
Yeah, a little bit. But it's not like some spy movie or anything.
Okay, good. So what are they all about?
They're basically ways to communicate outside those official channels, often through people who have special access or insights.
So it's more about building trust and exploring options sort of behind the scenes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Before things become official.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about Kissinger and the opening to China.
Yeah.
That whole thing was helped along by Pakistan.
Really? Pakistan?
Yep. Not the most obvious choice,
Mhm.
but they acted as a go-between.
Wow, that's interesting. And it wasn't public knowledge at the time, right?
Not at all. Or look at the Iran nuclear deal.
Okay.
The Sultan of Oman was super important there as a trusted intermediary between the U.S. and Iran.
It's amazing how much goes on that we don't even know about.
It is, right. And it all comes back to personal connections.
That seems to be a recurring theme here.
Yeah, these back channels rely on those relationships, building trust in a way that's not possible in the public eye.
Right, it's all about those quiet conversations.
Exactly. And sometimes those informal moments can tell you more than any official statement.
Oh, I totally agree. You pick up on so much from those subtle cues.
It's true. Eisen tells this story about being in Moscow during the Cold War, and he saw this subtle diplomatic standoff. It was fascinating how even tiny gestures were loaded with meaning.
Like a game of chess almost, where every move matters.
It is like that. It shows you that diplomacy is happening all the time, not just in the formal negotiations.
It's about the body language, the tone of voice, everything.
Exactly. It's those unspoken things that develop between people when they spend time together,
It reminds me of the story about Bernie Aronson and the Colombian peace talks.
Oh, right. With the FARC guerrillas?
Yeah, he actually went beyond the negotiating table and visited a sick guerrilla member in the hospital.
That's right. It was a huge risk, but it really showed his commitment to building trust.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to think about bridging that kind of divide.
It shows that human connection can sometimes overcome anything.
Powerful stuff. But okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about military force.
Okay, yeah.
Because it seems like the opposite of diplomacy, doesn't it? How does Eisen reconcile those two ideas?
Well, he's very clear that military force should always be a last resort,
It should never be the first option, that's for sure.
Right, exactly. Only when everything else has been tried, diplomacy,
Yeah.
sanctions, you name it.
But what about situations where diplomacy just doesn't work? Like when a country is violating international law or committing terrible acts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real concern.
Yeah.
Does diplomacy just embolden them?
Right. It's a tough question.
It is. But Eisen says even when military force is necessary,
Okay.
it has to have a clear political objective, like a goal in mind.
I see. So it's not just about using force for the sake of it.
Exactly. And he uses the Iraq War under George W. Bush as an example.
Yeah.
Remember that mission accomplished banner?
Oh, yeah. Didn't quite work out that way, did it?
Nope. Eisen contrasts that with the first Gulf War.
With Bush Sr.
That's right.
Yeah.
The goal there was very clear. Get Saddam out of Kuwait.
And they achieved that.
Yeah. And then they stopped. They didn't overextend their reach,
So knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to start.
Definitely. They understood that a long occupation would just create more problems.
So it's not just about winning the battle, it's about the bigger picture.
Exactly. Eisen has this great quote about it, something like, before you fire the first shot, you got to know what the political outcome's going to be and then build your strategy around that.
That's a good one. It's a reminder that military action should always be part of a bigger plan, not just a reaction.
Absolutely. And he points to the Balkan Wars as a good example of this.
Okay, how so?
The combination of diplomacy and NATO intervention worked there
Right.
because the Security Council was unified. and they had clear objectives.
So it was a coordinated effort, not just a show of force.
Exactly. It was strategic and purposeful.
Makes sense. But okay, let's jump to another big moment. The fall of the Berlin Wall.
Ah, yeah. A moment that seemed to come out of nowhere.
Did anyone actually see it coming?
You know, it's funny because even the experts were surprised.
Wow.
And Eisen's take on it highlights how important intelligence is in diplomacy.
Okay, tell me more.
Knowing what's happening, understanding the other side's dynamics, anticipating changes, it's all crucial.
So even when you think you know what's going on, there's always more to the story.
Definitely. You got to stay informed. But, you know, even in a moment of victory, like with the Soviet Union collapsing, there's still a need for careful diplomacy.
You mean not pushing too hard or humiliating the other side?
Exactly. Yeah. Eisen points to George H.W. Bush's approach as a great example.
What did he do?
He resisted the urge to exploit the Soviet Union's weakness.
That's pretty amazing considering the circumstances.
It is. He understood that a more careful approach would help build a stable world after the Cold War.
It's incredible to think that these decisions made decades ago are still shaping the world today.
It's true. But, you know, things have changed a lot since then. The rise of autocracies, challenges to democracy, and, of course, social media.
Yeah, it feels like diplomacy is facing a whole new set of obstacles now.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
And Eisen is concerned about the rise of isolationism. You know,
like countries turning inward.
Exactly. He argues that the U.S. needs to stay engaged in the world, keep playing a leadership role.
Okay, but not just intervening in everything.
No, he's advocating for a strategic approach.
Makes sense. Using all the tools we have.
Right. Diplomacy, military force when absolutely necessary, economic leverage, you know, the whole toolbox.
To create a more stable and prosperous world, hopefully.
That's the goal. But you know what else Eisen criticizes?
What's that?
The inconsistencies in American foreign policy.
Oh, interesting.
He says it's often driven by domestic politics, not a long-term vision.
I can see that, like flip-flopping on issues depending on who's in power.
Exactly. He uses climate change as an example.
Makes sense. It's hard to be taken seriously on the world stage if you keep changing your mind.
Right. It's a reminder that even the best diplomats can't always escape domestic politics.
It's true. And it shows how important it is for the public to understand these issues.
Absolutely. Because foreign policy affects all of us. But, you know, Eisen also talks about the impact of social media.
Oh, yeah. How could we forget social media?
It's crazy how much it shapes our view of the world now.
Totally.
He talks about how young people are getting their news from places like TikTok.
Where things are often presented without context, yeah.
Exactly. It's a real concern.
Yeah.
And it highlights the need for critical thinking and media literacy, now more than ever.
It's so easy to get caught up in the echo chamber, believing what you see without questioning it.
It is. He actually cites a study that found a lot of young adults couldn't even identify Auschwitz.
Wow, that's really concerning. It shows a real gap in our understanding of history.
It does, right. And that's why diplomacy is so important. It's not just about governments and treaties.
It's about understanding each other, right? Combating misinformation.
Exactly. Building a shared sense of history and responsibility.
That's a powerful thought. And it brings us back to Eisen's main message, doesn't it?
It does, that we need to refocus on diplomacy.
Not as something outdated, but as a vital tool for the 21st century. It's pretty clear that diplomacy's got its work cut out for it in today's world. But for those of us who aren't, negotiating peace treaties or dealing with global crises, what can we actually learn from all this? Are there any takeaways for our everyday lives?
You know, that's something Eisen seems to be asking himself, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah. While his book is mostly about professional diplomacy, he does encourage readers to think about how those same principles could apply to their own lives, personally and professionally.
I like that. But I'm curious, what are some concrete examples? How do we use those skills in our daily interactions?
Well, think about the qualities Eisen talks about.
Determination, courage, all that.
Yeah, and the ability to listen, build trust, truly understand someone else's perspective, even if you disagree.
It's true. Those are valuable skills in any situation where you're trying to find common ground.
Exactly. Whether you're disagreeing with a coworker, trying to see a friend's point of view, or even just making sense of the news.
It's about choosing to build bridges rather than walls.
Well said. And that's maybe Eisen's most important message. That diplomacy isn't just for diplomats.
Right.
It's a way of thinking, a way of being in the world. And it's more important now than ever.
So we can all play a part in creating a more peaceful world.
Exactly. Even in our own little corners of the world.
That's actually really inspiring.
And if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out Eisen's book.
The Art of Diplomacy.
Yeah. It's a really fascinating read, and it'll definitely stay with you.
I totally agree. It reminds us that diplomacy isn't just a job, it's a way of life. So, as you go about your day, think about those lessons we talked about.
Yeah.
How can you apply them to your own interactions at work, at home, in your community? How can you be a force for understanding and bridge building in a world that often feels so divided?
Great questions to think about. And remember, even small acts of understanding and empathy can make a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's a great place to wrap things up, I think.
I agree.
Until next time, everybody, keep diving deep.